Picture this. A young graduate sitting across from three corporate executives who hold his entire future in their hands. His palms are sweating. His heart's pounding so hard he's convinced they can hear it. And then, one of them laughs. Not with him, at him. Philosophy degree? The interviewer's eyes scan the resume like it's a joke someone printed out. What are you going to do with that? Ask our clients deep questions about the meaning of life? The other people in the room, all three of them, chuckle along, like it's the funniest thing they've heard all week. That was Marcus Chen, 3 years ago, in what seemed like the worst interview of his life. But what happened next? What happened when that interviewer opened the sealed envelope Marcus had brought with him? It didn't just change the interview, it changed everything. But before we get into that, drop a comment right now and tell me the country and city you're watching from. I'm gonna shout out as many of you as I can in the next video. Let's continue. To understand how Marcus ended up in that room, we need to go back to where it all started. Not the interview, that comes later. We're talking about the moment he told his parents he wanted to study philosophy. Marcus's dad was a mechanical engineer, worked for the same company for 30 years. His mom was a nurse. Between them, they represented everything practical, everything stable, everything that made sense in the world. And there was their only son, sitting at the dinner table senior year of high school, telling them he wanted to spend 4 years studying Plato and Kant and Nietzsche. The silence was deafening. "Son," his dad finally said, putting down his fork with that careful precision he used when he was trying not to explode. "How exactly do you plan to make a living asking questions nobody cares about?" His mum was gentler, but somehow that made it worse. "Honey, we just want you to be secure. Philosophy it's wonderful as a hobby, but what?" Marcus interrupted. He was 18 and headstrong and convinced he had everything figured out. "But I should just do what everyone else does? Get some boring degree, work some boring job, and wonder my whole life what I could have been?" Looking back, Marcus would cringe at how arrogant that sounds. But at the time, he meant every word. He'd spent the last 2 years of high school absolutely consumed by ideas. Not just philosophy, but the way philosophy connected to everything else. Politics, ethics, science, art. It was like someone had given him glasses that let him see the scaffolding behind reality. His English teacher, Mrs. Chen, had noticed. She'd given him extra books to read, stayed after school to discuss them with him. She told him once, "Marcus, most people go through life never asking why. You can't seem to stop. That's rare. Don't waste it." So he didn't. Marcus applied to exactly one school, a small liberal arts college about 3 hours from home. He got in with a decent scholarship, and despite his parents' concerns, despite everyone telling him he was making a mistake, he went. Those 4 years were everything he'd hoped for and nothing he'd expected. The coursework was brutal. People think philosophy is just sitting around having deep thoughts, but it's not. It's rigorous logic, dense texts, arguments so intricate you need to diagram them on poster board just to keep track. Marcus pulled more all-nighters in philosophy than his roommate did in pre-med. But he loved it. Every minute of it. Well, almost every minute. Junior year is when the doubt crept in. It started small. family gatherings where relatives asked what Marcus was studying, and their faces fell when he told them. "Oh, philosophy. That's nice." And then they'd turn to his cousin, the accounting major, and actually engage in conversation. Then it was his peers, the engineering students talking about their internships at major tech companies, the business majors landing positions at startups, the computer science kids getting recruited before they even graduated. And Marcus? He was writing papers about the nature of consciousness and whether free will exists. Don't get him wrong, he still believed in what he was doing. But doubt is insidious. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly sets up shop in the back of your mind and starts whispering. What are you going to do after graduation? That's the question, isn't it? The question every college student dreads. But philosophy majors get asked approximately 8,000 times more often than everyone else. Marcus didn't have a good answer. He'd thought about graduate school, maybe becoming a professor. But those positions were scarce, competitive, often required a decade of poverty-level stipends. He thought about law school. Philosophy majors actually score higher on the LSAT than pre-law students, statistically. But law school was expensive, and Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to be a lawyer. So what did that leave? Senior year, Marcus did what everyone does. He started applying for jobs. Any jobs. Everything from marketing coordinator to content strategist to management trainee. Positions where a bachelor's degree in anything was technically acceptable. The responses were not encouraging. Most companies didn't respond at all. A few sent generic rejection emails. One recruiter was honest enough to tell him over the phone, "Look, you seem smart, but philosophy? It doesn't exactly scream business ready. We need someone who can hit the ground running." Marcus started to panic. His roommate, David, was a practical guy. Economics major, already had a job lined up at a consulting firm. One night, after Marcus had gotten yet another rejection, David found him staring at his laptop screen like it might spontaneously generate a job offer. "You know what your problem is?" David said. "Enlighten me." "You think philosophy is what you do, but it's not. It's how you think. You need to figure out where that thinking is valuable." It was good advice, but generic. Where was thinking valuable? Everywhere and nowhere, depending on who you asked. That's when Marcus met Professor Whitmore. Professor James Whitmore taught Marcus's senior seminar on ethics and decision theory. He was in his 60s, had this white beard that made him look like a philosophy professor from Central Casting, and he had a reputation for being brutally honest. He was also the only professor who'd ever worked outside academia. Before his PhD, he'd spent 15 years in business, consulting, strategic planning, corporate ethics. Then he'd burned out, gone back to school, and ended up teaching. Marcus had never had a class with him before senior year. Looking back, that was a mistake. He should have sought him out earlier. The seminar was small, just 8 students, and it wasn't about memorizing theories or analyzing texts. It was about application. They took real-world scenarios, corporate scandals, policy decisions, technological dilemmas, and worked through them philosophically. One day, about halfway through the semester, the class was discussing the Volkswagen emissions scandal. How could an entire company, full of presumably decent people, collectively decide to cheat emissions tests and lie about it for years. Everyone had theories: corporate culture, perverse incentives, groupthink. But then Professor Whitmore asked a different question. If you were hired as a consultant to Volkswagen after this scandal, knowing what you know about ethics and human behavior, how would you restructure their decision-making process to prevent it from happening again? The room went silent. This wasn't a theoretical question. This was practical. This was real. Marcus raised his hand. You'd need to change the incentive structure, obviously. But more than that, you'd need to create what Kant called categorical imperatives. Principles that employees literally couldn't violate, regardless of the consequences. Build them into the evaluation process, the promotion criteria, maybe even the contract. Professor Whitmore tilted his head. Go on. But you'd also need to address the culture of silence. Whistleblower protections aren't enough. You need to create an environment where questioning orders is expected, not exceptional. You could use something like Rawls's veil of ignorance in leadership training. Make decision-makers consider policies without knowing what role they'll play in the outcome. Marcus kept going, building out this whole framework. The class stared at him. He thought maybe he'd said something stupid. But Professor Whitmore was smiling. After class, he asked Marcus to stay behind. Marcus, he said, what are you doing after graduation? Marcus gave him the honest answer. Panicking mostly. The professor laughed. You're good at this. Better than you realize. You know what the business world is desperate for right now? People who can think clearly about complex problems. People who can see second-order effects. People who understand human motivation and ethical frameworks and can translate that into action. So, you think I should go into business? I think you should stop seeing philosophy as separate from business. The best strategic thinkers I ever worked with were philosophy people. They just didn't have philosopher on their business cards. He pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote down 3 companies. These places explicitly hire philosophy majors. They're not huge names, but they're growing, and they value what you can do. Apply. List me as a reference. Marcus took the paper, looked at the names. They were consulting firms he'd never heard of, but they all had one thing in common. They worked on complex, interdisciplinary problems. Policy analysis, strategic forecasting, organizational ethics. One more thing, Professor Whitmore said. When you get an interview, and you will, don't apologize for your degree. Don't act like it's a handicap you need to overcome. Philosophy is your advantage. Own it. Marcus applied to all 3 companies that night. 2 didn't respond. The third, a firm called Meridian Strategy Group, invited him for an interview. The interview was scheduled for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks to either prove Professor Whitmore right or confirm his parents' worst fears. Marcus did what any desperate philosophy major would do. He researched obsessively. Meridian Strategy Group was fascinating. They were small, maybe 30 employees, but they worked with major clients. Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, non-profits. Their whole pitch was that they didn't just provide data and recommendations, they provided frameworks for decision-making in complex, uncertain environments. In other words, they did philosophy. They just called it strategy consulting. Marcus found interviews with their CEO, Dr. Patricia Meridian. She had a PhD in political philosophy from Princeton. In one interview, she said something that stuck with him. Most consultants tell you what to do. We teach you how to think about what to do. There's a difference. He prepared like his life depended on it. Because it kind of did. Marcus created a portfolio of his best work, papers he'd written, projects he'd completed. But he didn't just include them. He rewrote the introductions to show how each one applied to real-world business or policy problems. His paper on game theory and cooperation, he framed it as being about negotiation strategy. His thesis on moral luck, he connected it to risk management and accountability. David helped him practice interview questions. They went through all the classics. Tell me about yourself. What's your greatest weakness? Why should we hire you? But David also pushed him on the hard one. What can you do with a philosophy degree? Marcus must have answered that question 50 different ways over those 3 weeks. Eventually, he landed on something that felt true. Philosophy teaches you to think clearly about complicated problems. It teaches you to identify assumptions, trace implications, and construct arguments that hold up under scrutiny. Most importantly, it teaches you to be wrong in productive ways. To update your thinking when you encounter better evidence or reasoning. In a world that's increasingly complex and uncertain, that's not a luxury. It's essential. David nodded. That's pretty good. But can you say it without sounding like you're giving a lecture? Fair point. The week before the interview, Professor Whitmore called Marcus into his office again. I'm writing your recommendation letter, he said. I want you to know what I'm putting in it. Okay. I'm not going to tell them you're brilliant or hard-working or any of that generic nonsense. I'm going to tell them exactly what I saw in my class. The Volkswagen discussion. Your ability to take abstract concepts and make them concrete. Your willingness to challenge ideas, including mine. And I'm going to tell them that if they don't hire you, they're making a mistake. Marcus didn't know what to say. But Marcus, the professor continued, I'm going to seal the envelope, old school, and I'm going to ask you to hand deliver it. Why? Because I want you to have something in your pocket during that interview, something you know is good, even if you can't see it. Confidence is half the battle. He printed the letter, signed it, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it to Marcus. The envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The day of the interview, Marcus woke up at 5 a.m. Couldn't sleep. He tried to eat breakfast and barely managed half a piece of toast. He put on his one good suit, bought specifically for this, still had the tags on it until the night before, and he looked at himself in the mirror. He looked terrified. You're a philosopher, he told his reflection. Act like one. This was not a helpful pep talk. The interview was at 2 p.m. Marcus arrived at 1:30, because that's what you're supposed to do. The office was in a converted warehouse downtown. Modern but not flashy. Lots of glass and exposed brick. People working at standing desks, whiteboards covered in diagrams. The receptionist smiled at him. "Marcus Chen? That's me. They're running about 10 minutes behind. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "Water's good." Marcus sat in the waiting area, clutching his portfolio and the sealed envelope from Professor Whitmore. He watched people walk by. They all looked competent and confident, and like they belonged there. He felt like an imposter. Finally, a woman in her 40s came out, professional but not stuffy. She extended her hand. "Marcus? I'm Jennifer Hartley, Director of Strategic Analysis. Thanks for coming in. Follow me." They walked through the office to a conference room, glass walls, a long table, and sitting at it were 3 people. Marcus's heart sank. Panel interview. Nobody had mentioned it would be a panel interview. Jennifer introduced them. "This is Robert Chen, our lead consultant. No relation, I assume." She smiled. "This is Dr. Sarah Okonkwo. She heads our policy division. And this is Michael Brennan. He's one of our partners." Marcus shook everyone's hands, trying to project a calm he absolutely did not feel. They all sat down. Michael Brennan, mid-50s, expensive suit, the kind of guy who looked like he'd been born in a boardroom, spoke first. "So, Marcus, tell us about yourself." Marcus gave his prepared answer. 2 minutes, hitting the key points. Philosophy major, passionate about problem-solving, excited about the intersection of theory and practice. They nodded politely. Not enthusiastically, just politely. Then Sarah Okonkwo looked at his resume. Philosophy degree from... She named his small liberal arts college. "Can you walk us through why you chose that path?" Marcus explained. The love of ideas, the rigor, the way philosophy taught him to think. More polite nods. Then Robert Chen leaned forward. He was younger than the others, maybe early 30s, and there was something skeptical in his expression. "Look, Marcus, I'm going to be blunt because I think you deserve honesty. We've interviewed a lot of candidates for this position. Most of them have degrees in economics, political science, international relations, fields with direct relevance to what we do. You're the first philosophy major we've brought in." Here it comes, Marcus thought. "So, help me understand," Robert continued. "What exactly are you going to bring to the table that all those other candidates can't?" It was a fair question. It was also terrifying. Marcus took a breath. "You're right that philosophy isn't a direct path to this work, but I'd argue that's actually an advantage. The candidates you mentioned, they've been trained in specific frameworks and methodologies. That's valuable. But it also means they might have blind spots, places where they default to familiar approaches even when the situation calls for something different." He was warming up now, the nervousness starting to convert into energy. "Philosophy trains you to question frameworks themselves, to ask not just what should we do, but what assumptions are we making when we decide what to do. That's what you're selling, right? Not just answers, but better ways of thinking about questions. That's philosophy." Robert tilted his head slightly. Not convinced, but listening. Michael Brennan jumped in. "That's a nice pitch, Marcus. But let's get concrete. Give me an example of a problem you've worked on where philosophical thinking made a real difference." This was Marcus's moment. He'd prepared for this exact question. He told them about a project he'd done junior year, working with a local non-profit that was trying to decide how to allocate limited resources between two programs. One that provided immediate relief to homeless individuals, another that focused on long-term housing solutions. The director was stuck, Marcus explained. Both programs were good. Both helped people. But they only had funding for one. Most people would frame this as a numbers game. Which program helps more people, or helps them more effectively? And that's wrong? Sarah asked. It's incomplete, because it ignores the question of what we owe to people in different circumstances. If you help 100 people short-term but leave 10 people in chronic homelessness, is that better or worse than helping 50 people permanently? It depends on your ethical framework. Utilitarian? Probably the former. Kantian? Maybe the latter. Because you're not treating the chronic cases as means to a statistical end. Marcus kept going, explaining how he'd helped the director think through not just the numbers, but the values and principles underlying the decision. In the end, they'd found a hybrid approach, neither pure option, but something that balanced immediate need with long-term solutions. The room was quiet when he finished. Then Michael Brennan smiled. Not a polite smile, a real one. "That's good," he said. "That's actually really good." Marcus felt a flutter of hope. And then Robert Chen crushed it. "Okay, but here's my problem," Robert said, and his tone had shifted from skeptical to something harder. "That's a nice story about helping a non-profit, but we don't work with non-profits. We work with corporations and government agencies with billions of dollars on the line. Decisions that affect thousands of employees, millions of customers. The stakes are higher. The pressure is intense. And frankly, I'm not convinced that sitting around thinking about Kant is going to prepare you for that." The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. Sarah looked down at her notes. Michael's smile faded. But Robert kept going. And if I'm being totally honest, every time we've taken a chance on someone from a non-traditional background, it's been a disaster. They can't keep up. They don't have the technical skills. They fold under pressure. He tapped Marcus's resume. "Philosophy degree? What are you going to do with that? Ask our clients deep questions about the meaning of life?" The other people in the room actually chuckled. Nervous laughter, but laughter. Marcus felt his face go red, felt that horrible mix of humiliation and anger rising in his chest. This was it. The moment his parents had warned him about. The moment everyone who'd ever questioned his choices had been waiting for. He could have backed down, could have apologized for his degree, tried to spin it as something else, begged for a chance despite his obvious inadequacy. But then Marcus remembered Professor Whitmore's words. "Don't apologize for your degree. Own it." And he remembered something else the professor had said. "The best strategic thinkers I ever worked with were philosophy people." So Marcus didn't back down. "You're right," he said quietly. Robert blinked, not expecting agreement. "You're right that philosophy doesn't teach me your specific technical skills. But you're wrong about what philosophy does teach. And I think, with respect, you're wrong about what this job actually requires." "Oh no," Marcus thought immediately. "Too far. Way too far." But it already started. This firm's entire value proposition, according to your website, is helping clients navigate complex, uncertain situations where traditional analytics fall short. You're brought in when there's no clear answer, when the data points in multiple directions, when stakeholders disagree. Right? Michael nodded slowly. That's not a technical problem. That's a philosophical one. It's about clarifying values, identifying trade-offs, and constructing frameworks for decision-making when there's no obvious right answer. And yeah, maybe I don't know your specific industry tools yet, but I can learn those in 6 months. What I already know, how to think clearly under uncertainty, that takes years to develop. And it's not something you can just pick up from a weekend seminar. The room was dead silent. Marcus knew he'd blown it. He was certain of it. Robert was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Sarah was wide-eyed. Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear. Michael was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. Finally, Michael spoke. "Do you have your letters of recommendation?" "Oh, right, the envelope." Marcus's hands were shaking as he pulled out Professor Whitmore's sealed letter. He slid it across the table to Michael. Michael looked at it, sealed with actual wax, old school, like Professor Whitmore had said. "May I?" Michael asked. "Of course." He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, started reading. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough that Marcus noticed. Michael read for what felt like an eternity, then passed the letter to Sarah. She read it, raised her eyebrows, and passed it to Jennifer. Jennifer read it and smiled slightly. Finally, it reached Robert. Robert read it again, looked up at Marcus, then back at the letter. Then he did something Marcus didn't expect. He laughed. A real laugh, not mocking, but surprised. "Well," Robert said, "that's quite a letter." "What does it say?" Marcus asked, unable to help himself. Michael folded it back up. "Your professor makes a compelling case. He describes a specific instance where you took an abstract ethical framework and applied it to a real business scenario in his class. Says you saw implications that he hadn't even considered. And then..." He paused. "He says that if we don't hire you, we're idiots who don't understand what we actually do." "He said that?" "Not in those exact words," Sarah jumped in, "but close." There was another long silence. Then Michael stood up, extended his hand. "Marcus, thank you for coming in. We'll be in touch in the next few days." Marcus left that interview in a daze. He'd defended his degree, argued with a potential employer, and basically told them they were wrong about their own job requirements. Career suicide, he figured. He called Professor Whitmore from his car. "How'd it go?" the professor asked. "I think I ruined it. I got defensive. I challenged one of the interviewers. Good, Professor Whitmore interrupted. "What?" "Marcus, if they want someone who'll just nod and agree with everything, they can hire any of those economics majors. If they want someone who can think independently and stand by their reasoning even under pressure, they need someone like you. You showed them who you are. Now we'll see if they're smart enough to recognize it." 3 days later, Marcus got the email. His hands were shaking when he opened it. "Dear Marcus, Thank you for interviewing with Meridian's strategy group. We were impressed by your preparation, your thoughtfulness, and your willingness to challenge our assumptions. This is a rejection, Marcus thought. This is the nice version of thanks but no thanks. We would like to offer you a position as a junior analyst starting at... He had to read it 3 times before it sank in. They hired him. The philosophy major with no business experience and no technical skills who'd argued with them in the interview. They actually hired him. When Marcus called to accept, Jennifer Hartley told him something interesting. Robert was the one who pushed hardest for you after the interview. He said anyone who could defend their reasoning that clearly under pressure was exactly who we needed. Also, he wanted me to tell you he's sorry for being harsh. It was a test. A test? We need people who can think under pressure, who don't fold when challenged. You passed. Marcus started the job 6 weeks later, and you know what? Professor Whitmore was right. Philosophy wasn't separate from the work. It was the work, just translated into corporate language. That was 3 years ago. Today, Marcus is leading his own projects. He's worked with clients in tech, healthcare, energy, and government. He's presented findings to board members and CEOs and policymakers. And every single day, he uses what he learned studying philosophy. The ability to analyze arguments, essential for picking apart complex policies. The training in ethics, crucial for helping clients navigate moral dilemmas. The practice of intellectual humility, vital for admitting when he's wrong and updating his thinking. Marcus's parents came around, by the way. Last Thanksgiving, his dad asked him to explain what he actually does. Marcus walked him through a recent project, and when he finished, his dad said, That's actually pretty impressive. High praise from an engineer. And Robert Chen? He's now Marcus's mentor. They get lunch once a month. Last time, Robert told him, You know what I've learned working here? The people with the practical degrees, they're good at executing known solutions. But you philosophy people? You're good at figuring out what the problem actually is. That's harder and more valuable. So here's what you should take from Marcus's story. Whatever you're studying, whatever path you're on, if people are telling you it's useless or impractical or won't lead anywhere, maybe they're right. Or maybe they just don't understand what you're building. Skills are specific. They're useful, but they're also limited to particular contexts. Thinking is universal, and it's rare. If you can think clearly, argue effectively, and stay humble enough to change your mind, you'll figure out the specific skills. You'll find your place. Don't let anyone make you apologize for learning how to think.